So without further ado, Mr. Blumenthal.
So before I really get started in earnest, I just want to say how glad I am to be here with Daniel May 1.0, 2.0, and Rebecca, and I'm especially glad that Rebecca and Daniel are doing the work that they're doing. And I want to congratulate the SJP on their victory, because they've made this conversation possible. This is a conversation that's been suppressed for so many years, and they're promoting a more open and honest debate. It's a victory no matter whether you get an alternative hummus or not. And also it's great that Daniel filled in at the last second. I don't know why there's no pro-Israel speaker from an established organization. I heard they couldn't come, but I do sense an anxiety on their part. I noticed they're ducking these debates at other universities. This is not a debate that they want to have. And even Alan Dershowitz is discovering that the case for Israel is a little bit harder even than the case for O.J. Simpson. Why? Because in the face of international condemnation, the state of Israel refuses to change its ways. Like Ionesco's rhinoceros, the country's leadership only grows more stubborn and hard-hearted by the day. They've offered no alternative to the Moloch they helped create, and no coherent vision for the future. But before we go into the future, or begin discussing any strategies to address the situation, like BDS, we need to reach into the past to understand how we got to this tragic juncture. The nightmare that we're experiencing now didn't begin with the colonization of the West Bank after the '67 war, when a handshake between the secular kibbutznik Yigal Allon and the religious fanatic Moshe Levinger signaled the birth of the violent Jewish settlements around Hebron. And it didn't arrive with the rise of Foreign Minister Avigdor Lieberman, a fascist whose ascent was enabled by the law of return, a discriminatory policy which encouraged his constituent base to return to Israel, even though they'd never been there, many had no living Jewish relatives, and many had no knowledge of the Jewish religion. No, horrors that we're witnessing today are merely symptoms of a deeper problem that spans back decades. And I could go further back before 1937, but starting there, the Palestinian Arabs were in open revolt against the British Empire and the Zionist movement. With partition inevitable and Jewish military dominance over the Palestinians assured, David Ben-Gurion, the leader of the Yishuv and future Prime Minister of Israel, wrote to his son Amos, "A partial Jewish state is not the end, but only the beginning. The establishment of such a Jewish state will serve as a means in our historical efforts to redeem the country in its entirety. We shall organize a modern defense force, and then I'm certain that we will not be prevented from settling in other parts of the country, either by mutual agreement with our Arab neighbors or by some other means. We will expel the Arabs and take their places with the force at our disposal." This is also language you heard in Theodore Herzl's diaries. By 1947, Ben-Gurion's plan seemed likely to come to fruition when the UN adopted Resolution 181 for the partition of Palestine. But while Ben-Gurion accepted the plan, the Palestinians boycotted the vote and rejected it completely. And if you listen to the pro-Israel propaganda of today, you'll hear about this a lot. But we have to recognize that the Palestinian objection was based on a sound principle. As the renowned Palestinian historian Walid Khalidi explained, the native people of Palestine, like the native people of every other country in the Arab world, Asia, America, Africa, and Europe, refused to divide the land with the settler community. Meanwhile, renowned Jewish cultural figures like the philosopher Hannah Arendt and Judah Magnus, the first rector of Hebrew University, warned that partition would lead to a massive human catastrophe. And unfortunately, they were right. Take a close look at the map the UN proposed, which is divided into 3 zones. One zone was reserved for 800,000 Palestinian Arabs and no Jews. The second, which was to be Israel, was reserved for 500,000 Jews and 438,000 Palestinians, so almost an equal balance. The Zionists accepted this, but if the Palestinians had accepted it too and called their bluff, the Zionist movement probably would have rejected it. Why? Because according to the plan, Israel would not have enjoyed a clear enough Jewish majority to ensure a Jewish and democratic state, as they outlined in the Declaration of Independence. They have no constitution, by the way. It would simply have been a democratic state, like the United States, and Ben-Gurion and his cohorts would have none of that. So they initiated a massive campaign of ethnic cleansing, And if you have any objection to my use of that term, just consider that in the orders handed down by the high command to the Zionist militias, the word tihur, or cleanse, was used in the orders. To cleanse the Palestinian villages, expel them, and in December 1947, 5 months before any of the Arab armies entered into Palestine, at least 400 Palestinian villages were destroyed, and some 750,000 Arabs were ultimately expelled to faraway refugee camps. Yitzhak Pondek, a top commander of the Zionist forces, witnessed the expulsions with joy. "My heart is singing," he wrote in a forthcoming memoir excerpted recently by the Israeli paper Haaretz. "There were 200 Palestinian villages here, and there are no more. It was necessary to destroy them. Otherwise, there would have been here another million Arabs among us." And after 2,000 years of exile, one cannot create a state by using silk gloves. So the silk gloves didn't fit. As the war neared its conclusion, the United States nation's mediator, a Swedish diplomat named Folke Bernadotte, who had secured the release of 35,000 prisoners from Nazi concentration camps during World War II, proposed a resolution to the conflict. His proposal acknowledged the existence of a Jewish state in part of Palestine, but it also called for the repatriation of Palestinian refugees expelled from Jewish territory. The Israelis had not expected him to do for the Palestinians what he had done for the Jews in World War II. So 2 days after introducing his plan, Bernadotte was assassinated by a band of Jewish terrorists in a plan approved by the future Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir. Nevertheless, the UN honored Bernadotte's memory and accepted his legacy by approving Resolution 194, affirming the right of return for Palestinian refugees, a law that is at the heart of our debate today. Now, as I said before, the real reason I'm focusing on the ideas and policies that led to Israel's foundation is to help us elucidate why peace is so elusive today. By looking at how Israel engineered a Jewish majority by force, we can see the violence its leaders so routinely authorize as a means of maintaining the demographic edge their country gained in 1948, and as a means to hold on to the property it looted through the absentee law of 1950, which banned refugees and the internally displaced from reclaiming even the furniture they left behind when they were expelled. As Arnon Sofer, a Haifa University professor and director of the Institute for National Security Studies in Israel, who represents the nexus between Israeli academia and the occupation, said after the unilateral Gaza disengagement, which he orchestrated, which he helped design, "If we want to remain alive, we will have to kill and kill and kill all day, every day." And so they did with Operation Cast Lead. By studying the foundations of Israel, we can understand why the Jewish and democratic state must by its very nature keep the refugees who make up 70% of the population of Gaza in a giant prison that is besieged on all sides, and why it must refuse readmission to the refugees living in squalid camps in neighboring countries. It must do this forever, because if the refugees were ever allowed to return to reunite with their family members inside Israel, Israel would have to become like any of the countries it claims to emulate, a normal democracy. To ward off the looming specter of normal democracy, where race has no place in law or life, the Israeli government has begun to act against its own citizens. The Shin Bet, for example, has labeled all Palestinian citizens of Israel as a quote-unquote strategic threat. So when Azmi Bishara, the Palestinian intellectual and legislator, issued a call to make Israel into a state of all its citizens, his party was disqualified from elections not once but twice, and he was forced into exile under questionable charges of spying. A bill currently under consideration by the Knesset seeks to criminalize Bashar's replacement, Jamal Zahalka, and other Arab members of parliament for the vaguely defined act of incitement. Meanwhile, another member of Bashar's party, Hanan Zouabi, was nearly physically attacked by a mob in the Knesset, and on and on. I'm running out of time, so I just would say none of the issues I've introduced and plan to discuss in more detail throughout the evening are resolved by the so-called peace process. Initiated and overseen by politically compromised, transparently biased American negotiators, the peace process has been all process and no peace. It seeks to create an authoritarian Palestinian Bantustan in the West Bank and a separate and unequal Jewish state with nebulous borders. Yet it has not resulted in the removal of a single established settlement unit, not one. It dangles bribes of advanced weaponry before Israel to buy short-term freezes on settlement construction. And when Israel turns its back and authorizes more settlement units, the US forks over the weapons anyway. This process, which organizations like J Street have invested so much energy into, will never mete out any consequences to Israel for its immoral and illegal policies. Citizens around the world are no longer content with the counsels of patience, passivity, and delay. They know that the occupier will not let go of his own accord. He must be forced. In 2005, a coalition of 170 Palestinian civil society organizations issued a call for nonviolent boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaigns to demand that Israel comply with international law. This is what we rise in support of today. It's a consensus of Palestinian society. It's supported by people who favor two states, by people who favor a binational state, by Jewish Israelis courageous enough to risk social castigation and even imprisonment to put their values into action. Because there's a bill that will ban BDS in Israel in the Knesset right now. All who participate are united by a commitment to non-violently unraveling the foundations of discrimination and occupation in Israel and Palestine. In closing, the BDS campaign does not only aim to change minds, it seeks to change behavior. And already it's demonstrated results by pressuring numerous Israeli companies to withdraw their businesses from the occupied territories. For example, the blood diamond millionaire Lev Levayev, one of the 16 oligarchs who controls 60% of Israel's economy, was pressured to stop building settlements in the West Bank. But we're not saying BDS is a panacea. It's simply a creative temporary tool that allows ordinary citizens to stand beside the Palestinians as they struggle for their freedom, just as Michael Shermer and Andrew Goodman stood beside James Chaney in the fight to end Jim Crow discrimination in the American South.